I was born in the year 1841 in Huntingdon County, Pennsylvania, in a settlement some 12 miles from the town itself. My father operated a cooperative, manufacturing barrels for local merchants and farmers, and we maintained a small farm where we cultivated vegetables and kept livestock sufficient for our subsistence. The world of my childhood was one of considerable order and stability, bounded by the mountains that enclosed our valley and by the rhythms of agricultural and artisan labor. I mention this because the circumstances of my later life stood in such stark contrast to these early years that they seem almost to belong to different existences entirely. My mother died when I was but 9 years of age in the winter of 1850. She succumbed to childbed fever following the birth of my youngest brother, who survived only 3 days longer than she. I recollect the events of that week with a clarity that has not diminished despite the passage of nearly 8 decades. My mother labored for 2 days before the child was born, a long and difficult travail that left her exhausted and fevered. The midwife, Mrs. Campbell, attended throughout, but she could do little beyond offering comfort and applying cool cloths to my mother's burning forehead. When the infant finally emerged, a boy we would have named Joseph, he appeared small and weak with a cry that seemed more a mewing than a proper infant's wail. My mother held him but briefly before the fever overtook her entirely. I sat beside her bed. I was permitted this because I was the eldest daughter, and I observed her face transform from the countenance I had always known to something foreign and terrible. She spoke words that made no sense, addressing persons who were not present, plucking at the bedclothes with restless hands. The midwife said this was common with childbed fever, that the poison in the blood affected the mind as well as the body. On the 3rd day after the birth, my mother ceased her restless movements and lay very still, her breathing shallow and rapid. That evening, just as darkness fell, she died. The infant Joseph, who had been unable to nurse properly and who grew weaker each day, followed her 3 days later. This double loss devastated our household. My father, who had been a man of steady temperament and moderate habits, became withdrawn and silent. He would sit at the supper table and stare at his plate without eating, or he would work in the cooperative with a kind of mechanical intensity, as if labor might somehow fill the void left by death. The burden of managing the household fell upon me, though I was scarcely capable of such responsibility. I'd observed my mother's work, certainly, but observation and execution are very different matters. I learned to cook, to clean, to mend clothing, to manage the provisions, all the duties that had been my mother's province, through a combination of dim recollection and desperate improvisation. My 2 older brothers, William and Thomas, assisted my father in the cooperative and with the heavier farm labor. My younger sister, Catherine, who was but 6 years old, required constant supervision and fell into fits of weeping for our mother that would last for hours. Those first months after my mother's death remain among the most difficult of my life. I rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, to milk the cow, to set bread to rising. I spent the day washing clothing, tending the garden, preserving vegetables, spinning wool, sewing and mending, supervising Catherine, preparing the midday and evening meals. I fell into bed each night exhausted, my hands raw from work, my body aching. I was 9 years old, and I was performing the labor of a grown woman. Some days I would find myself weeping while kneading bread or stirring the kettle, overwhelmed by the impossibility of what was required of me. Yet there was no alternative. My father could not manage without someone to keep the household, and I was the only female old enough to assume the role. I attended the subscription school when circumstances permitted, which amounted to perhaps 2 or 3 months each year. The schoolmistress was a widow from Philadelphia who had removed to our county following her husband's death, seeking cheaper living arrangements. Mrs. Adelaide Hartwell possessed considerable education and refined manners, and she took particular interest in my instruction. She recognized, I believe, that my circumstances were exceptionally difficult, and she extended to me a kindness I had not experienced since my mother's death. She lent me books from her personal library, volumes of poetry, essays, and moral instruction, and she encouraged me to continue my studies despite the demands upon my time. She would say, "Your mind requires nourishment as much as your body, my dear. Do not neglect it simply because your hands are occupied with labor." I recollect reading by candlelight after the household had retired, exhausting my eyes with small print, but unwilling to relinquish the window these books provided into worlds beyond my narrow experience. I read Milton's Paradise Lost, though I comprehended but a portion of it. I read Pope's Essay on Man and various moral essays by Johnson and Addison. I read novels, Pamela, Clarissa, The Vicar of Wakefield, that transported me far from our cramped cabin in Pennsylvania. These books were my education and my escape, and I treasured them accordingly. Mrs. Hartwell told me I possessed an aptitude for learning that exceeded most of her pupils, and she suggested that if circumstances were different, I might have attended a female academy and pursued more advanced studies. But circumstances were not different, and such possibilities remained forever beyond my reach. When I reached the age of 16, in the year 1857, a young man named Daniel Whitmore began to call upon me. He was the son of a farmer whose property adjoined ours to the north, some 3 miles distant. Daniel was 22 years of age, tall and strong, with a serious countenance and a reputation for industry and sobriety. I had known him slightly for several years, as our families attended the same Methodist church, but we had not spoken with any intimacy until he began his visits. My father approved of his attentions, recognizing that marriage would relieve our household of one mouth to feed and would secure my future. The economics of the situation were transparent to everyone, though no one spoke of them explicitly. I possessed no particular romantic sentiment regarding Daniel, but I esteemed him and believed he would prove a reliable husband. He was not eloquent or particularly refined, but he was honest and hard-working, and he treated me with respect. We would sit in my father's parlor on Sunday afternoons, conversing stiffly about mundane matters, the weather, the crops, the sermons we had heard, while my father sat nearby working on his accounts and serving as chaperone. Daniel would occasionally bring me small gifts, a length of ribbon from Huntingdon, a book of poems he had purchased at considerable expense, though he himself read little, a preserved quince from his mother's kitchen. These tokens touched me, for they represented his attempts to court me according to forms he did not naturally inhabit. We were married in April of 1858, at the Methodist Church in Huntingdon, with a modest gathering of family and neighbors in attendance. I wore a dress of gray wool that I had sewn myself, the finest garment I had ever possessed. Daniel wore his Sunday suit, freshly brushed and mended. The ceremony was brief and plain, conducted by Reverend Patterson according to the Methodist rites. We spoke our vows solemnly, pledging ourselves to each other until death should part us. I was 17 years old and felt myself very adult and very frightened. After the ceremony, we hosted a small dinner at my father's house. Boiled ham, bread, preserves, and a simple cake. Then Daniel drove me in his wagon to the cabin that would be our home, and our married life commenced. Daniel and I established our household in a cabin on his father's farm, where he worked the land on shares. The cabin was small but adequate. 2 rooms, a loft for sleeping, a stone hearth. I brought to the marriage my mother's spinning wheel, her good cooking pot, her Bible with her name inscribed inside the cover, and the few linens I had managed to preserve. Daniel provided the essential furniture, a rough table and benches he had constructed himself, a bedstead, a few cooking implements, basic farming tools. We were poor, but no poorer than most young couples embarking upon married life. I anticipated that we would cultivate our plot, raise children, and gradually accumulate the modest prosperity that rewarded diligent labor. The first year of our marriage passed with the ordinary adjustments required when 2 persons accustom themselves to shared life. Daniel rose before dawn and worked until darkness, clearing stumps, repairing fences, plowing and planting and harvesting. I maintained the cabin, prepared meals, tended the kitchen garden, preserved vegetables for winter, spun wool and wove cloth, and performed all the domestic labor upon which a farming household depends. We spoke little, for we were both exhausted by our labors and possessed little inclination toward extended conversation. But we were not unhappy. Daniel was kind to me in his way, never raising his voice, never demanding more than I could reasonably provide, sharing whatever money he earned from the sale of surplus crops. I had known worse situations, and I was grateful for the relative stability he offered. Our first child, a son we named Daniel after his father, was born in February of 1859. The birth was difficult, attended by a midwife from Huntingdon who expressed concern about my narrow hips and general constitution. I recovered slowly, remaining weak for several months afterward. The infant thrived, however, and Daniel, my husband, took great pride in his namesake. We baptized the child at the Methodist Church, and I recollect standing in the cold February air, holding my son wrapped in his christening blanket, feeling a contentment I had rarely known. The years 1859 and 1860 passed with the ordinary trials and satisfactions of rural life. We harvested tolerably well both seasons. I bore a second child, a daughter we named Mary, in November of 1860. She was smaller than her brother had been, and she struggled with various ailments during her first winter, but she survived. I found myself occupied entirely with the care of 2 small children, the management of our household, and the cultivation of our kitchen garden. Daniel worked from dawn until darkness, clearing additional land, repairing fences, tending the crops and livestock. Then came April of 1861, when the news reached our community that Fort Sumter had been fired upon, and that President Lincoln had called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. The fervor for war swept through Pennsylvania with remarkable intensity. Though we were far from the fighting and possessed little direct stake in the political disputes that had precipitated the conflict. Daniel attended a recruitment meeting in Huntingdon in May and returned home with the announcement that he had enlisted in a company forming for 3 years' service. I was stunned by this intelligence. We had never discussed the possibility of his enlisting, and I could not comprehend why he would voluntarily absent himself from his family and his farm. When I protested, Daniel explained that the bounty money would enable us to pay his father for our share of the harvest and perhaps to purchase additional land. He believed the war would conclude within several months. Everyone believed this in the spring of 1861, and that he would return home with money saved from his soldier's pay. He assured me that his father would assist me during his absence.
Before we continue, a quick word. I've released 14 full recordings that will never be on YouTube. These are the voices too personal, too raw to share publicly, completely unedited, nothing cut. If you want access, the link is in the description. It's called The Lost Recordings, and getting it helps us keep making these videos. Alright, back to the story.
And that I would manage tolerably well. I wept and pleaded, but his decision was fixed. He departed in June of 1861, leaving me with 2 small children, Daniel aged 2 years and 4 months, Mary aged 7 months, and with promises that he would write regularly and return before the year's end. Daniel's letters arrived with some regularity throughout the summer and autumn of 1861. He had been assigned to the 49th Pennsylvania Infantry Regiment and was encamped near Washington City, undergoing training. His letters described camp life, the drilling, the poor food, the diseases that afflicted the men. He wrote in a plain hand with simple language, for his education had been limited. But I treasured each letter and read them repeatedly until the paper grew soft from handling. He mentioned no combat, for his regiment had not yet been engaged. In one letter from August he wrote, "We drill 6 hours each day, learning to march in formation and to load and fire our rifles. The officers say we must become soldiers and not remain farmers. The food is cornmeal and salt pork mostly, which sits heavy in the stomach. Many men have the flux and must visit the sinks constantly. I remain tolerably well. I think of you and the children often. Kiss young Daniel and Mary for me. Your affectionate husband, Daniel Whitmore." I wept when I read this letter, for it captured so plainly the reality of his situation, the transformation from farmer to soldier, the diseases, the homesickness. Another letter from October described a review by General McClellan. Today, the entire army formed up for review by General McClellan. There must have been 50,000 men in formation, perhaps more. The general rode past on his fine horse, and the men cheered him greatly. He's not a tall man, but he sits his horse well and appears every inch the soldier. The officers say we will march into Virginia soon and that the war will be concluded before Christmas. I hope this proves true, for I am weary of camp life and wish to return home. The nights grow cold now, and we have insufficient blankets. Your devoted husband, Daniel. In December, he wrote that they would likely see action in the spring, that the war was proven more difficult than anticipated, but that he remained confident of Union victory. This was the last letter I received. He wrote, The officers now say the war will not end quickly as we had hoped. The rebels are more numerous and better organized than we supposed. We hear reports of great battles being planned for the spring. I confess I am apprehensive about facing combat, but I trust in Providence and in the righteousness of our cause. If I should fall, know that I loved you and the children, and that I did my duty as I understood it. But I do not expect to fall. I am strong and careful, and I mean to return to you. Keep the children well. I remain your loving husband, Daniel Whitmore. I read this letter dozens of times, particularly the passage about falling, and I prayed fervently that he would indeed return safely. In March of 1862, I received a visit from Captain Morrison, who had commanded Daniel's company. He appeared at our cabin on a cold March afternoon, riding a tired horse and wearing a travel-stained uniform. I knew immediately from his countenance that he brought terrible news. He removed his hat and said, "Mrs. Whitmore, I regret to inform you that your husband, Private Daniel Whitmore, was killed during the Battle of Kernstown in Virginia on the 23rd of March. He was struck by a Minié ball in the chest and died within minutes. He did not suffer long. He was a good soldier and a brave man." The captain returned Daniel's personal effects, his pocket watch, which had belonged to his father, his testament, with my name inscribed inside, the letters I had written to him, tied with string. He expressed his condolences and departed after refusing my offer of refreshment, saying he had other notifications to make in the county. I stood in our cabin, holding these objects, all that remained of my husband, unable to comprehend that Daniel was dead and that I would never see him again. I had been a wife for not quite 4 years, and now I was a widow at the age of 20. I had 2 small children depending upon me, and I possessed no resources, no income, no prospects. The enormity of my situation did not register immediately. I simply stood there, holding Daniel's watch and feeling its weight in my hand, trying to understand that this cold metal object had more permanence than the man who had carried it. The months that followed were the most difficult of my life to that point. Daniel's father, who had promised to assist me, proved less helpful than anticipated. He was elderly and in poor health, and he possessed limited resources. He provided some cornmeal and salt pork, but he could not spare labor to maintain the farm. The crops I had planted in the spring grew poorly, for I lacked the strength to cultivate them properly while caring for 2 small children. By summer, it became evident that I would not harvest sufficient food to sustain us through the winter. I sought employment in Huntingdon, hoping to secure work as a seamstress or domestic servant, but opportunities were scarce. Many women found themselves in similar circumstances, widowed by the war and desperate for any means of support. The few positions available paid wages insufficient to maintain an independent household. I made what money I could by taking in washing and mending, but the income was inadequate. By autumn of 1862, I had exhausted what small savings we possessed, and I was falling into debt to the merchants who supplied me with provisions on credit. In November of 1862, I discovered I was with child. This realization filled me with despair. I calculated that I must have conceived in February or March, shortly before Daniel's death. I would give birth in August or September of 1863, and I could not conceive how I would manage 3 children alone. The pregnancy itself rendered me weaker and less capable of the physical labor required to earn money. I grew thin despite my condition, for I was giving most of our food to the children. Young Daniel, now nearly 4 years old, had developed a persistent cough. Mary, approaching 2 years of age, was small and sickly. I appealed to my father for assistance, but he was struggling himself. My brother William had also enlisted and had been killed at Antietam in September of 1862. My father, grief-stricken and financially strained, could provide only the barest help. My sister Catherine, now 18 years old, had married and removed to Ohio. My brother Thomas was preparing to enlist. I stood alone, a widow of 21 years with 2 small children, and another expected, possessing no resources and no prospects. The child, my 3rd child, was born on the 2nd of September, 1863. I labored alone in the cabin, for I could not afford the midwife's fee. The birth was arduous and prolonged, lasting through the night and into the following afternoon. When the child finally emerged, I saw that I had borne a daughter. She was small but appeared healthy, with a vigorous cry and strong movements. I wrapped her in clean cloths and put her to my breast, and she nursed readily. I named her Sarah, after my mother. I attempted to care for all 3 children, but the burden exceeded my capacity. I was weakened by the birth and by months of inadequate nutrition. My milk was thin and insufficient for the infant. I possessed no money to purchase food or fuel for winter. The cabin was falling into disrepair. The roof leaked, the chimney smoked, the door hung crooked on its hinges. Young Daniel's cough worsened, and Mary developed a fever that lasted several days. I sat in that cold cabin in October of 1863 with 3 hungry children and no means of feeding them, and I recognized that I could not sustain this situation. I made inquiries in Huntingdon regarding charitable institutions that might assist me. The local minister directed me to a family, Mr. and Mrs. Edward Thornton, who had recently lost their only child to diphtheria and who had expressed interest in adopting an infant. The Thorntons were prosperous merchants who owned a dry goods store in Huntingdon. They were respectable people, members of the Presbyterian Church, known for their charitable works. The minister suggested that if I were willing to relinquish Sarah to their care, she would be raised in comfortable circumstances and would receive advantages I could never provide. This suggestion horrified me initially. The idea of giving away my child, my daughter, barely 6 weeks old, seemed monstrous. Yet as I considered my circumstances, I could perceive no alternative. I had 2 other children who were suffering from my inability to provide adequately for them. If I retained all 3 children, it seemed probable that we would all perish from starvation or exposure during the coming winter. If I relinquished Sarah to the Thorntons, she would survive and would likely prosper. My other 2 children, with 1 fewer mouth to feed, would have better prospects. The arithmetic was cruel, but irrefutable. I called upon Mrs. Thornton in November of 1863. I had wrestled with the decision for days, lying awake at night listening to Sarah crying from hunger, to young Daniel coughing, to Mary whimpering in her sleep. I had prayed until the words became meaningless repetitions. I had examined every possible alternative and found none that did not lead to disaster. Finally, on a gray November morning, I dressed Sarah in the cleanest garments I possessed, wrapped her in a worn shawl, and walked the 3 miles into Huntingdon to the Thornton residence. The Thornton house stood on High Street, a substantial brick structure with shuttered windows in a well-maintained yard. A servant answered my knock and regarded me with some suspicion. I must have appeared quite wretched, thin and poorly dressed, carrying an infant wrapped in rags. I stated that I wished to speak with Mrs. Thornton regarding a matter of importance, and after some hesitation, the servant admitted me to a side parlor and went to fetch her mistress. Mrs. Thornton appeared after several minutes. She was a woman of perhaps 35 years, with a kind but melancholy countenance. She wore a dress of black silk, mourning attire for her deceased daughter, and her hair was arranged simply. When she entered and saw me holding Sarah, something changed in her expression. She approached and said, "May I?" gesturing toward the infant. I unwrapped Sarah and placed her in Mrs. Thornton's arms. Mrs. Thornton looked down at Sarah with such tenderness, such longing, that I nearly reclaimed my daughter and fled. But I remained. "Reverend Patterson suggested I speak with you," I began, my voice unsteady. "I'm a widow. My husband fell at Kernstown last year. I have 2 other children and no means of support. I cannot provide for 3 children. The minister said you had lost your daughter and might be willing to—" I could not complete the sentence. Mrs. Thornton looked up from Sarah, her eyes filled with tears. "What is her name?" she asked. "Sarah," I replied. "She was born the 2nd of September. She's 11 weeks old." Mrs. Thornton held Sarah against her shoulder, rocking gently. "My Emily was 3 years old when diphtheria took her. It has been 8 months, but I think of her every moment. This house feels empty without a child's presence. I've prayed for some way to fill this void." She paused, then looked at me directly. "You understand what you're proposing? You would give me this child to raise as my own?" I nodded, unable to speak. Mrs. Thornton continued, "I must be honest with you. If I take Sarah, I will love her as my daughter. I will give her every advantage. But I believe it would be better for her if she does not know of her origins, if she grows up believing my husband and I are her natural parents. The knowledge that she was given away might cause her pain. Would you be willing to relinquish all claim, to not seek contact or information?" The question struck me like a physical blow. She was asking me to erase myself from Sarah's life entirely, to become as if I had never existed for her. Yet I understood the reasoning. A child growing up knowing she had been unwanted, or believing herself unwanted, which might not be the truth but would appear so, would suffer. If Sarah believed herself the natural daughter of the Thorntons, she would feel secure in her place. She would never need to know that her mother had abandoned her. "I would agree to those terms," I said, though each word cost me. "I want what is best for Sarah. If that means she never knows me, then so be it." Mrs. Thornton nodded slowly. "I will love her," she said. "I will treat her as if she were Emily returned to me. She will want for nothing. I give you my word on this." We discussed the practical arrangements. There would be no legal documentation. Such formalities were uncommon for informal adoptions in those days. Mrs. Thornton would simply take Sarah into her household and raise her as her daughter. I would receive no compensation, nor did I seek any. The understanding was that this separation would be permanent and absolute. I would not visit, would not write, would not attempt any contact. Mrs. Thornton believed this was necessary for Sarah's well-being, and I was in no position to dispute her judgment. "When should I bring her?" I asked. "Whenever you feel able," Mrs. Thornton replied. "There is no need to prolong this. The separation will be painful regardless of when it occurs." We agreed that I would return in 1 week on the 21st of November. Mrs. Thornton showed me to the door, still holding Sarah. At the threshold, I reclaimed my daughter for what I believed would be our final week together. Mrs. Thornton touched Sarah's cheek gently and said, "1 week, then. I will prepare everything necessary." I walked back to our cabin carrying Sarah, and I wept the entire 3 miles. On the 21st of November, 1863, I brought Sarah to the Thornton residence. That final week with her had been both precious and agonizing. I held her constantly, memorizing her features, the shape of her eyes, which were dark like mine, the curve of her small mouth, the way her tiny fingers would grasp my thumb. I nursed her, even though my milk remained thin and inadequate. I sang to her the lullabies my mother had sung to me. I spoke to her as if she could understand, telling her I loved her, that this was not abandonment, but the only way I could ensure her survival. Young Daniel, not quite 5 years old, asked why I was crying so often. I told him Mama was tired, which was true but not the whole truth. Mary, at age 3, was too young to comprehend what was happening. She played with her corn husk doll, oblivious to the tragedy unfolding. I did not tell them they were about to lose their sister. I could not bear to add their grief to my own. On that final morning, I dressed Sarah in the best garments I possessed, which were nevertheless poor and worn. I had washed and mended them as best I could, but they remained unmistakably the clothing of poverty. I wrapped her in my mother's shawl, one of the few fine things I still owned, thinking that Sarah should have something of her grandmother's, even if she would never know from whom it came. I arranged my hair and tried to make myself presentable, though I could do little to disguise my exhaustion and malnutrition. The walk to the Thornton residence seemed both too long and too short. I wanted to prolong this final time with Sarah, yet I wanted it to be over, for the anticipation of loss was nearly as painful as the loss itself. I spoke to Sarah as I walked, though she could not understand. I told her I was sorry. I told her I hoped she would forgive me someday, even though she would never know there was anything to forgive. I told her she would have a good life, better than anything I could provide. Mrs. Thornton had prepared a beautiful nursery with a proper cradle, fine linens, and all manner of infant necessities. She received Sarah from my arms with great tenderness, and I saw immediately that she would love this child. Sarah looked at me with her dark eyes. She had my eyes, and my mother's eyes, and I kissed her forehead and whispered that I loved her and that this was for her benefit. I touched her face one final time, committing to memory the softness of her skin, the warmth of her small body. Then I turned and departed, walking back to my cold cabin through the November rain. I did not look back. If I had looked back, I would have turned around, would have reclaimed her, would have doomed us all to starvation rather than endure this separation. So I walked forward, my arms empty, my body aching with the absence of her weight, and I did not look back. I've never seen Sarah again. That was 66 years ago, and not a day has passed that I have not thought of her and wondered about her fate. I do not know if she lived to adulthood. I do not know if she married or bore children of her own. I do not know if she was happy. I relinquished all claim to such knowledge when I placed her in Mrs. Thornton's arms on that November day. The winter of 1863 and 64 remained difficult, but young Daniel and Mary survived it. With only 2 children to feed, I managed to provide adequate sustenance. Young Daniel's cough gradually improved. Mary grew stronger. By spring, I had secured steadier work taken in sewing, and our circumstances slowly stabilized. In 1865, following the war's conclusion, I met a widower named Henry Crawford, who had lost his wife to typhoid fever in 1864. Henry had 3 children of his own and was seeking someone to manage his household. We married in June of 1865, a practical arrangement rather than a romantic attachment. I brought my 2 children into his household, and we raised his 3 and my 2 together. We had no additional children, which was perhaps fortunate given our limited means. The years passed. Young Daniel grew to manhood and became a carpenter. He married in 1884 and eventually removed to Ohio, where work was more plentiful. Mary married in 1887 and remained in Pennsylvania. She bore 6 children, of whom 4 survived to adulthood. Henry and I maintained our household until his death in 1908, when he was 67 years of age. I continued to live in Huntingdon, taking in boarders and performing such light work as my advancing years permitted. Throughout all these years, I thought constantly of Sarah. I would see young women of the approximate age she would be, and I would study their faces, wondering if any of them might be my daughter. I walked past the Thornton residence many times, observing from a distance, never approaching. I saw Mrs. Thornton occasionally in town, accompanied by a child who I assumed was Sarah, but I honored my agreement and did not speak to them. Mrs. Thornton aged and eventually passed from this life. I learned of her death in 1897 from a notice in the newspaper. Mr. Thornton had died some years earlier. I did not know what became of Sarah after Mrs. Thornton's death. I have wrestled for more than 6 decades with the question of whether I acted rightly in relinquishing Sarah. I can articulate the rational arguments that justified my decision. I was destitute, widowed, unable to provide for 3 children, facing the prospect of all of us perishing from want. Sarah went to a family who could offer her material comfort, education, and social position, advantages beyond anything I could have given her. If I had retained her, she might have died of starvation or disease in that wretched cabin. The choice I made was, by any practical calculation, the correct one. Yet knowledge of the practical correctness of a decision does not eliminate the pain of it. I gave away my child, my infant daughter, my flesh and blood. I held her for 11 weeks and then delivered her into the arms of strangers. I agreed never to see her again, never to know her fate, never to claim her as my own. What manner of mother does such a thing? I tell myself that I acted out of love, that I sacrificed my own happiness for her welfare. But another voice within me whispers that a true mother would have found some way to keep her child, that I failed in the most fundamental duty a woman possesses. The shame I have carried is considerable. I never told Henry the full story of Sarah's relinquishment. He knew I had borne a child who had been adopted, but I did not speak of the circumstances or of my continuing grief. I never told young Daniel or Mary that they had a sister who had been given away. They were too young at the time to remember Sarah clearly, and I allowed them to forget. I created a silence around her existence, and in that silence she became almost spectral, a daughter I had borne, but who had never truly belonged to me. I observed other women in similar desperate circumstances who managed to retain their children despite poverty and hardship. I saw widows working themselves nearly to death to provide for their offspring, enduring privations that I had not been willing to endure. I wondered if I had simply been too weak, too cowardly, too willing to surrender in the face of difficulty. These thoughts tormented me, particularly in the dark hours of sleeplessness that increase with age. Yet I must also acknowledge the historical circumstances that circumscribed my choices. I was a woman alone in the 1860s, widowed by a war I had not supported, left without resources or assistance. Society provided almost no support for women in such circumstances. There existed no government aid, no charitable institutions adequate to the need, no employment opportunities that would have enabled me to earn sufficient income while caring for small children. The options available to me were severely limited. Marry again quickly, rely upon reluctant relatives, or relinquish children I could not support. I chose what seemed the least destructive of poor alternatives. I have thought often about what Sarah's life might have been had I retained her. She would have grown up in poverty, wearing threadbare clothing, eating inadequate food, receiving minimal education. She would have worked from a young age to contribute to the household. She might have married young to escape these circumstances, or she might have remained trapped in the same poverty that had defined my life. She would have known me as her mother, but she would have known me as a woman defeated by circumstances, struggling and failing to provide adequately for her children. Whether such knowledge would have brought her happiness, I cannot say. Instead, if she survived, and I must hope she survived, she grew up as the daughter of prosperous merchants living in a comfortable home, receiving education and refinement. She would have worn fine clothing, eaten adequate food, learned music and literature and all the accomplishments befitting a young woman of her class. She would have had opportunities that I could never have provided. She would have married, perhaps, into a respectable family. She may have had children and lived a good life. This is what I must believe, for any other outcome renders my sacrifice meaningless. I am now in my 88th year, and I recognize that I have not many more years remaining in this world. I have lived long enough to see the turn of the century, to witness the Great War and its aftermath, to observe the world transformed by inventions and social changes that would have seemed fantastical in my youth. I've outlived my husband, my brothers, my sister, and most of those I knew in my early years. Young Daniel died in 1922 at the age of 63. Mary lives still in Pittsburgh, and I receive letters from her occasionally. I reside now in a small room in a boarding house in Huntingdon, cared for by the proprietress and by Mary's daughter, who visits weekly. As death approaches, I find myself preoccupied with thoughts of Sarah. I don't know if there is an afterlife, or if I shall encounter those I have loved in some future existence. But if such a place exists, and if Sarah preceded me there, I wonder what I shall say to her. How does one explain to a daughter that one gave her away? How does one justify such an action, even with the best intentions? I imagine meeting her and seeing in her face the child I held for those brief 11 weeks, and I imagine her asking why I abandoned her. I have no adequate answer to give. I have considered attempting to discover what became of Sarah, to make inquiries, to search for records, to learn whether she lived and what manner of life she experienced. Yet I have refrained from such investigation, partly from fear of what I might discover, and partly from a sense that I relinquished the right to such knowledge when I placed her in Mrs. Thornton's care. I made an agreement, and I have honored it. Perhaps this is the final cruelty, that I shall die without ever knowing what became of the child I bore and surrendered. There are those who would judge me harshly for what I did, and I cannot dispute their right to such judgment. I judged myself harshly for many years, but I have come to understand that moral judgment becomes complicated when applied to circumstances of extreme deprivation and limited choices. It's easy to declare what one would do when speaking in the abstract, far more difficult when one faces the actual situation with all its terrible immediacy. I made the choice that seemed necessary at the time, and I have lived with the consequences of that choice for the remainder of my life. I tell this story not to excuse myself or to seek absolution, but simply to testify to a truth that is not often acknowledged, that poverty and circumstance can force women into choices they would never make under better conditions, and that those choices leave wounds that never fully heal. I gave away my daughter 66 years ago, and I have carried the weight of that decision every day since. If Sarah lived, she's now an old woman herself, perhaps with children and grandchildren who know nothing of my existence. I am a ghost in her history, if I exist there at all. I would wish for her to know, if it were possible, that I loved her. I loved her during those 11 weeks when I held her and nursed her and cared for her. I loved her on that November day when I placed her in another woman's arms. I have loved her every day of the 66 years since, though she has not known it. I gave her away because I loved her, because I wanted her to survive and to prosper in ways I could not provide. Whether she would accept this explanation, I cannot know, but it is the truth, and it is all I have to offer. The world has changed immeasurably since 1863 when I made that terrible choice. Women now have opportunities that were unimaginable then. There are institutions to assist widows and orphans, employment opportunities for women, legal protections, and social support. The circumstances that forced my decision have been ameliorated, though not eliminated. Yet I suspect there are still women who face impossible choices, who must choose between evils, who carry the consequences of those choices for the remainder of their lives. For those women, I offer my testimony as evidence that they are not alone in their suffering. I shall die soon, and when I do, the secret of Sarah's existence will die with me, for I have told no one of this in full until now. Young Daniel never knew he had another sister. Mary does not remember. Sarah herself, if she lives, does not know that I am her mother. The truth will be buried with me in the Huntingdon Cemetery, and it will be as if Sarah had never existed at all, or as if I had never borne her. This erasure seems somehow fitting. I erased myself from her life in 1863, and now time will complete the erasure. Yet I have this one desire before I die, that someone should know what happened, that someone should bear witness to the fact that there was a child named Sarah, born on the 2nd of September, 1863, who was loved by her mother, even though her mother gave her away. I want someone to know that her mother thought of her every day, wondered about her fate, hoped for her happiness, and carried the grief of separation until the end of her days. This is my testimony, and this is my truth. I was a mother who gave away her child, and I have never forgiven myself, nor do I expect forgiveness. I simply want it known that Sarah existed and that she was loved.